Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's full Scottish. Apologies for our late start today. There was a problem with the internet. So my name is Brian Liddy. It's Sunday the 22nd of June, and on the programme this week we're delighted to be joined by Siobhan Tolland, councillor for Dundee. Good afternoon, Siobhan. How are you?
Hi, not too bad, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And we're also joined this afternoon by Professor Murray Pittock from the University of Glasgow. Good afternoon, Murray. How are you?
I'm very well, Brian. I hope you are yourself.
Yes, thank you. It's been to start with, we've got the Middle East and Ukraine war updates. Um, so, uh, so in Gaza, forgive me, it's a bit rushed this morning. Gaza, at least 55,908 Palestinians have been killed and 131,138 people have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. While the killing continues in Gaza, and even as the US was bombing Iran, Israeli forces stormed the old prayer hall of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied Jerusalem shortly after midnight last night. Israel has imposed strict entry restrictions for Muslim worshippers into the mosque for 9 days under a state emergency linked to Israel's attack on Iran. In Iran, Trump announced that massive precision strikes on Fordow, Natanz and Isfahan have completely obliterated, in his words, Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities. He called Iran the bully of the Middle East and said it must now make peace or face further attacks, which would be far greater and a lot easier. Trump thanked Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying the two had worked together as a team like perhaps no team has ever worked before. He praised Israel's efforts against Iran, but said Saturday's strikes could only be done by the US. Trump warned Iran there will either be peace or there will be tragedy, saying there are many targets left in the country for the US to hit. If peace does not come quickly, we will go after those other targets with precision, speed and skill. Senior officials from the Pentagon, including Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth, will hold a press conference today at 8 o'clock. Iran Foreign Minister Abbas Araki posted on X, "The United States, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has committed a grave violation of the UN Charter, international law and the NPT by attacking Iran's peaceful nuclear installations. The events this morning are outrageous and will have everlasting consequences. Each and every member of the UN must be alarmed over this extremely dangerous, lawless and criminal behaviour in accordance with the UN Charter and its provisions, allowing a legitimate response in self-defence. Iran reserves all options to defend its sovereignty, interest and people." UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' statement said, "I am gravely alarmed by the use of force by the United States against Iran today. This is a dangerous escalation in the region already on edge and a direct threat to international peace and security. There is a growing risk that this conflict could rapidly get out of control with catastrophic consequences for civilians, the region and the world. I call on member states to de-escalate and to uphold their obligations under the UN Charter and other rules of international law. At this perilous hour, it's critical to avoid a spiral of chaos. There is no military solution. The only path forward is diplomacy. The only hope is peace." In a statement, Keir Starmer called on Iran to return to the negotiating table and said that stability in the region is a priority. Starmer described Iran's nuclear programme as a grave threat to international security. So, Siobhan. Oh, sorry, I'm being asked to carry on with the Ukraine update. Today is the 1,215th day of the war in Ukraine. Cllr Tsikhanouski, a leading Belarus opposition figure, was freed on Saturday after more than 5 years in prison in the most significant move so far by Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko to try to ease his isolation from the West. Lukashenko has been shunned by the West for years and faced sanctions after brutally crushing pro-democracy demonstrations in 2020 and then allowing Vladimir Putin, his close ally, to launch part of his 2022 invasion of Ukraine from Belarusian territory. The release came just hours after Belarusian authorities announced that Lukashenko met with US President Donald Trump's envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, in Minsk, just hours before the attack on Iran, which is another major Russian ally. President Zelensky said that Russia sent Ukraine at least 20 of its own dead soldiers in recent exchanges with Kyiv, describing it as a result of Moscow's disorganization in carrying out large swaps of wounded prisoners of war and remains of troops. Zelensky said that an Israeli mercenary fighting for Moscow was among the dead that the Ukraine had received. Officials did not disclose the identities of the bodies. Zelensky has also accused Western firms of supplying Russia with machine tools used to make weapons in remarks made public on Saturday. He said companies from Germany, the Czech Republic, South Korea and Japan were among them, as well as one business that was supplying a small number of components from the United States. He said most of the companies supplying tools to Russia were from China, but dozens of Western firms were also culpable. We strongly urge everyone to impose sanctions on these companies, the Ukrainian leader added. President Zelensky also called on Ukraine's Western partners to allocate 0.25% of their GDP to helping Kyiv ramp up weapons production and said the country plans to sign agreements this summer to start exporting weapon production technologies. In remarks released for publication Saturday, Zelensky said Ukraine was in talks with Denmark, Norway, Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom and Lithuania to launch joint weapon production. He also said on Saturday he was planning staff changes in Ukraine's diplomatic corps and also in government institutions to boost the country's resilience. He gave no time frame for the decisions. Deportation of Ukrainians is part of a continuing cleansing operation of the occupied territories, which may accelerate ahead of any peace deal with soldiers, which solidifies Russian control over Ukrainian territory Moscow has seized over the past 3 years. Forgive me, Siobhan and Murray, for having to elide the what's happening in Gaza with the Ukraine. It's a lot to keep track of, but I think we should concentrate on the American attack on Iran, and maybe we can try and connect everything together. Siobhan, my first question to you is: has Donald Trump handed Iran the best excuse it could possibly have for going ahead and developing nuclear weapons?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? It's hard to say. I think that, there is this kind of weird logic internationally that those with nuclear weapons tend to feel a bit more protected, even though in actual reality that's probably not the case. But there's an old saying, better be hung for a sheep than a goat type thing, and Iran might be sitting thinking about that at this moment in time. It's the duplicity for me that kind of always galls in these areas. It's not like Iran is a paragon of democracy or equality or any of those things. It's just, Israel has nuclear weapons and has the gall to kind of, suggest to Iran that they can't possibly have them as well. And so there's that kind of structure. I think Israel's agenda, I think, has been relatively clear. Sorry, I should say Netanyahu's government's agenda, because we don't want to kind of put this all on the Israeli population here, but Netanyahu's agenda regarding Iran has been relatively clear, I think, over recent months, and that focus on them has been particularly kind of increasing. That last night's events have raised a whole host of new international fears, of course, and huge threats to peace. The problem that we now have, of course, is that Iran will probably inevitably escalate. So we end up in this spiraling situation, as the UN had suggested, that we can't quite get out of, and how fast that spirals is anybody's guess at this moment in time. Things seem to be spiralling very, very quickly since Trump came into power. And if we look at those connections as well, we'll maybe talk about that in a bit more detail. But if we look at the connections, Trump becomes that. He comes in, he picks a side, he allies with that side, he allows that side to kind of take military or aggressive action against the other side, and then says to the victim almost, you must now negotiate peace. It's a very Boolean international tactic. But yeah, it's a scary situation. My personal opinion is I think that Iran have been relatively patient amongst all the kind of targeting of recent months. But it looks very, very clear that their patience has now run out. It's not like Iran is a paragon of virtue here. It's not that situation at all. But international peace requires a bit more than just threatening and bombing, especially nuclear facilities.
Thank you, Siobhan. Murray, we've been waiting for China and Russia to give their responses. I thought it was interesting that Keir Starmer called on Iran to return to the negotiation table, but he didn't really criticise Trump. And we have hot off the press Russian statement. Russia has said it strongly condemns the US bombing of nuclear sites in Iran. They called it irresponsible and perhaps... Let me know what you think about it. They said it was a gross violation of international law. Is that not a bit rich coming from Russia?
Well, it is a bit rich coming from Russia. The trouble is that when international behaviour moves in a certain way and there isn't robust response, then it becomes very difficult to hold the line. So the invasion of Ukraine has all kinds, since it continues for more than 3 years later, holds all kinds of implications for loosening of the observance of international law and the extent to which any large power is prepared to abide by it. Because frankly, the consequences that the Russian Federation have suffered are not large, and they're getting smaller all the time, since the evident alignment of US foreign policy with the interests of the Russian Federation is very clear. And I think, as not for the first time, European leaders have been really slow to notice that Trump really doesn't mean it when he says that he intends to put sanctions on the Russian Federation, a 2-week or 3-week deadline. He doesn't mean it at all. He simply has been facilitating this the whole way through, as indeed Siobhan was implying. So I think that's the trouble. Who now has got clean enough hands to say that the US is out of line? And if it's China will no doubt make a routine statement of some sort, but China are very much looking at the prospect of adding Taiwan to the goodie bag of superpower acquisitions. So I think the trouble is that once you don't take action when there's a major violation, you simply open the door to further major violations. And this is the situation we're in now.
Thank you, Murray. Siobhan, I'm just wondering, is Donald Trump now going to claim that a Nobel Peace Prize is rightfully his? Because now he can say that he's stopped proliferation of nuclear arms in Iran.
I mean, anything's possible with Trump's self-image, right, and his assessment of his own abilities and inabilities. So there's nothing to stop him from saying it. I mean, Donald Trump is constantly lying and talking in the face of reality. He may, but the fact of the matter is, let's look at this on an individual or even social psychology level. Have we ever been so scared? Trump is out of control. We don't know what he's going to do. The problem with Trump is that there's no sense of rationality in his behaviour, and that makes him extraordinarily dangerous in my eyes. This is a moment in history where things are extraordinarily dangerous and teeter on the brink of catastrophe. So yeah, he could claim a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sure he will, but history will more than likely judge him otherwise.
Thank you, Siobhan. Murray, I'm just trying to cover as much ground as possible, so I'm not asking you all the same question. That news in the Ukraine update about Mr. Sikhanovsky, the Belarusian who was Alexander Lukashenko released him over the weekend. Does that maybe help us tie up connections between Russia and America and Iran and Israel?
Well, that's a big question for me. I mean, I think that the conversation with this program started suggested that perhaps there wasn't such a thing as coincidences. That may be so from the timing, but I really see that. I mean, I can't quite see, to be honest, how this can do more than give Lukashenko a foothold in the good books of President Trump and the U.S. administration, because what Lukashenko is looking for is to ensure that he has good relations with the US and with the Russian Federation. Given the geographical positioning of Belarus, he can hardly do anything else. He also doesn't want any outside power to fund or support his opposition movement. So having the leader of the opposition, former leader of the opposition, and his wife exiled in Lithuania is quite suitable. So I think it's an insurance policy from Lukashenko. Trump has shown that he has interest in the Russian Federation, but his interest in Belarus has been a lot more muted, if indeed it's been there at all. So Lukashenko is ensuring that he plays both sides. It's very hard for me to see how it could be directly impactful on the attack on Iran, but others may have clearer ideas about that. It just looks pretty straightforward. Low grade desire action to ingratiate yourself to a small extent with the U.S. government, an insurance policy.
Thank you, Murray. Siobhan, we're out of time on that, but I just wonder, is there anything that you haven't had a chance to say that you think is important? I mean, there's not been much mention. You did mention Netanyahu, but we didn't say much about Israel or the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. As anything that you'd want to add?
I mean, not necessarily. Maybe kind of picking up on a few issues there that Gaza's kind of got lost in the last couple of days, isn't it? Then Gaza's been that kind of almost, I think Netanyahu is using Iran as a distraction now. And I think we need to look at Netanyahu's self-interest here in terms of how his government works, that these are personal issues that help him retain power. And that makes him, I think, specifically more dangerous. This is an extreme right-wing government. There are allegations of corruption abound against him, and these actions are almost a distraction, but extraordinarily dangerous. And the same might be said for Iran's Ayatollah as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. So moving on to the University of Dundee, the Gillies report into Dundee University's key findings included poor financial judgment, inadequate management and reporting, poor monitoring of the financial key performance indicators, a lack of agility by the leadership in responding to a fall in income, weak governance in relation to financial accountability by the court. The report was followed by the resignations of the interim principal and vice-chancellor and the immediate departure of the acting chair of court and chair of finance and policy. Well, the situation at Dundee is unique. There are concerns about other universities and funding across the UK. Siobhan, a while back, you and I, along with Maggie Chapman, did an hour-long special dedicated totally to this, and you were able to give us unique insider insight into that. So I've just run through what the report found, but what do you think now is the future of Dundee University secure?
Just for clarity, I work in the University of Dundee. I'm also in the UCU union as well, so being heavily involved in the events of the last kind of 18 months or so. The discussion within, of course, the university executive group have kind of almost but collapsed. Most of them have resigned. You would have saw the immediate resignation of Shane O'Neill. Literally minutes, he must have been literally had his email all pre-prepared minutes after that report came out. The calls from UCU specifically is that we change the university executive group structure to a democratically elected one. I think that we're in this kind of very strange situation where we have paid absolute phenomenal amount of money for principals, vice principals, and what we've been given is utter incompetence. And I would suggest also attempts to cover up the extent to which the financial collapse was occurring, although the Gillies Commission was quite tentative in their assessment of whether there was a cover-up or not. But information was hidden, it was obfuscated, they didn't report information to the SFC where they were obliged to do so. The report was very clear that the decisions were made by 3 members and even hidden from the rest of the university executive group, and that was Ian Gillespie, who was the former principal, Shane O'Neill, who was the interim principal, then vice principal, and now left, as well as Jim McGeorge, who was the finance director at the time. They all knew. They knew it was happening. They knew that there was financial circumstances way beyond the assessment that they were given out. In fact, they knew that there were financial circumstances, and Gillespie sent an email to staff and gave a talk saying that we're now in a really financially robust position. We're now in surplus. This is great. Let's move on. There are lots and lots to unpick from that report. I'm still kind of working through bits and bobs of it, but we suspected this was the case. But to see that in writing and to have Ian Gillespie be accused of hubris is a very, very damning attack on an individual that should have taken control over that situation and chose not to. The Gillespie Commission said that there was about 3 or 4 occasions throughout this period since the first warning shot was September 23. They said there was 3 or 4 occasions since that point where they could have and should have taken action, and they chose not to do so, but to continue to spend as if nothing was happening. I think they said in isolation of the facts. So how we move forward is, the advantage here is that Shane O'Neill has now left, and I don't want to make it personal, but his actions of pretending to negotiate, pretending to discuss, pretending to be open with the unions and the staff across campus now become very clear, because what was happening is we now know that he knew. He said to the Education Committee that he didn't know until November 24, but he did know, and we know that now because of the Commission. So there's an opportunity there to kind of recreate a structure of governance that's much more accountable, and that's what the Gillespie Commission said. The Gillies Commission said as well, that there was a complete lack of governance and a breakdown of governance. So there's an opportunity here to kind of create a more democratic governance structure. I think it's also an opportunity to kind of rethink how we move forward. Rather ironically, we're probably a bit more safer in terms of our future now that Shane O'Neill has gone, because what we're now seeing is that he was a barrier to pushing things forward, and he was part of the problem. He always was, as we suspected. So perhaps we can kind of draw a line on some of these issues and start thinking afresh. We've also got the Recovery Task Force, of course, as well, thinking long term, and I'll be speaking, well, not be speaking, but I'll be on one of those meetings next week in terms of how they move forward in terms of the structure of the university, just in my capacity as a union committee member. So there's lots of issues to tease out, and that's against the general financial issues that universities are experiencing. Dundee is unique in the sense that we're experiencing similar issues, but how we handled those issues makes us extraordinarily unique and very, very vulnerable. So in that respect, there's perhaps an opportunity to kind of think a bit more clearly and I think a bit more democratically in terms of how we run a university.
Thank you, Siobhan. Incredible. Murray, the Gillies report, as Siobhan said, suggested a democratically elected structure. But what do you think about Siobhan's use
No
of the word?
apologies, the Gillies report did not. I'm suggesting a
Okay,
democratically
forgive me.
elected
Forgive
structure.
me.
The
Forgive me.
union is.
Okay, forgive me. Thank you for correcting me there. And so, Murray? What do you also think about Siobhan's revelations that there was a cover-up and action should have been taken, but wasn't? Forgive me, Siobhan, but it's alleged that there was a cover-up and spending went on as if nothing had happened. Have you been following it closely, or?
I've done a lot of advising of Scottish and other higher education sector institutions in areas related to governance and finance. And the Gillis report itself is, I think, all the information there are other inquiries, will need to proceed for the present. I think that it's not a report that indicates the need for a revolution, but it's a report that indicates what happens when you have a culture of groupthink and where people feel that they're immune to challenge, and where also the relations between different parts of the governance structure are, to put it perhaps politely, too intimate. So I think that's one of the things, or several of the things that are coming out of the report. The sector is has significant problems, which are caused by the unity resource impacting now south as well as north of the border. But obviously, home students' costs are not sufficiently covered by the Scottish government. And the overseas student environment has been strongly driven by visa changes, the availability of families to come with them, the persistent rhetoric around overseas students and migrancy, and of course the one-off problems such as the massive devaluation of the Nigerian currency, which has affected particularly Aberdeen and RGU. So at Dundee, there was a huge dip in overseas postgraduate numbers year on year, and that has caught the institution on the hop, and the response to it was too little, too late, and also possibly, though I'm not in a position to say that for sure, the financial projections about the risk of it were not equal to the likelihood of it. So that's the issue for Dundee. But the issue for Dundee is, I think, twofold. One is it's an example of what happens to a sector where the funding is volatile and at risk if there isn't a strong culture of accountability, governance, and financial control, and that comes through very clearly in the Gillis report. But it's also there's also a question, I think, about which is raised the relationship between the principal and principals at Dundee have been quite frequent of late, and the governing body. And there is a desire frequently when a new principal is appointed for the new principal to have a vision of the transformation of the institution. Transforming an institution can be done, but it's not easy, and it's extremely challenging. There have been some, and I won't expatiate on them now, successful cases in Scotland and the wider UK in the last 30 or 40 years, but not many. And frequently what happens is that visions are simply means of spending money without creating transformation. It's really important for any process for the appointment of university principals to be clear that the people appointed are able to discharge the fiduciary, custodial, and strategic aspects of the job. And that, frankly, is more important than that they have a vision for transforming the University of X into the best university in the world. Because guess what? They'll leave. It won't be. And a lot of money will have been spent. So we need to focus on actually a job description that matches the responsibilities to staff. And I feel very sympathetic towards all the staff at Dundee whose careers and livelihoods have been exposed by the failures in governance, which are reported on in the Gillis report.
Thank you, Murray. Murray, can I maybe stay with you? Jenny Gilruth and her statement on the Gillies report's findings said Dundee University was an autonomous institution which is ultimately responsible for decision making in its day-to-day operations, which kind of implies that it's a private organisation, it's privately funded. But universities aren't entirely private. They occupy this strange sort of partly private, partly public, and they're neither one nor the other, but they're both at the same time. Do you think, is that got something to do with the why Dundee University got into the bother it got into in the first place?
Well, it's got something to do with the pressure on the sector, because the pressure on the sector is twofold. It's a UK government environmental pressure on overseas students and the the more costly visa route, the inability of them to bring in their families and so on, which has led to pressure downward, or contributed to pressure downward on the number of overseas students. And it's also a Scottish government issue, because currently the unitary resource does not cover the cost of educating a home student. So in a sense, governments ask universities to provide a service, and they want to control the way the service is provided. And in that sense, the universities are independent actors. But on another sense, that's very variable, because some universities are global brands and have the capacity to gain a huge amount of income from outside the areas controlled by government funding. Others have got very limited ability to do any of that at all. So there isn't really a single sector. Universities are extremely diverse, and viewing them as a national sector, either in Scotland or the wider UK, has got a lot of problems attached to it, as well as perhaps a simplificatory aspect of policy which feels comfortable to politicians and funders. The truth is that universities differ, and a university like Dundee, which is very much caught in the middle, which has got global reach and international ambitions, but at the same time is not one of the big global brands. That's a university which is particularly vulnerable at a time like this, because its ambitions are not going to be matched by its income. But that is not to say that it's, as is very clear from the Gillespie Commission, that there were very serious failings in Dundee, which were particular to the university itself. But it just shows how near the edge the sector is living. Those mistakes could have been made another year and another decade, and they might not have had the terrible results they've had in Dundee in the last 12 months.
Siobhan, we've got a minute left on this item. I think we've got to give you the last words.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I think the kind of relationship between the kind of public and the private is an interesting one, and I have been kind of discussing this with friends and thinking it over as well. We're in a situation, and this is specific to Dundee perhaps, where the Scottish Government are now have been and have done given funding, but are now requested to provide additional funding to bail out an institution that, by their own folly, it was a self-inflicted harm, wasn't it? That we now have to kind of spend more public money to hold up this institution, because Dundee as a city is dependent upon it. It's a central core institution to Dundee's culture, economy, and finances. But that the university functions as a private institution, but subject to public money. So there's a thing there. My understanding is that the charity sector will now be investigating the University of Dundee, but there's a sense here that this is public money that's been squandered or not done appropriately. If you look at the graph of finances, you literally see the free fall of money within Dundee. And the frustrating thing as someone who works there and as a union member is all those opportunities that they could have taken, they didn't take, and that will now mean job losses for us as a workforce, where we did absolutely nothing wrong. In the college sector, of course, the Scottish Government could come in and bring in what's called special measures, but that's not necessarily the case, and that isn't the case in a university sector. That the issue of the kind of so you've got institutions like Oxford that can kind of hold their own and always have managed to hold their own. And one of the issues that the Gilley report suggested is that as Dundee fell in the rankings, what they did is they kept spending to the level of those where the rankings had been previously, but in comparison to other institutions by those rankings, they were overspending at that point. So there was that kind of complete inability to move according with the immediate times it was happening. The whole thing is an utter mess. I'm glad that the Gillies Commission and report did vindicate what the union had been saying all along, however, and there's now, my understanding is there's now investigations into the culture that's already been intimated, the culture that occurred within that, which unions had been raising for quite a long time, actually, as well. So we do need a cultural change in order to bring the university move forward. Yep.
Thank you, Siobhan, and we really do hope that does all resolve and turns out much better for everybody involved. Thank you. As the UK publishes its plans to cut disability benefits in England and Wales, the Scottish Government announced it was mitigating the UK two-child benefit cap and fully restoring pensioners' winter fuel payments. So is it time to implement the Scottish Government's proposed minimum income guarantee? A minimum income guarantee would establish an income level below which nobody is allowed to fall, and that would be done via reform to social security work and services, and that's from a report that was commissioned by the Scottish Government recently. Murray, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think I'm going to in an unusual context quote Edmund Burke and say circumstances are the key to any question. Until one sees the nature of the proposals, it's very difficult to actually take a view on them, and the level is always key. But I think one of the issues about naturally there's a lot of argument and support for a universal basic income out there, which this is related to, very strongly related to. And the studies that have been done on UBI generally show that there is an uplift in feeling of well-being by about 7% where it's been measured. And there are positive responses to receiving a basic income. But if you were to take the Institute for Employment figures from 2023, you'd see that the Roundtree Trust think a UBI needs to be at £28,000. One of £11,700 would have cost 678 billion in 2023 in the UK as a whole, and one put at £3,300 would have cost 274 billion in the UK as a whole. So I have no idea what this is going to look like or how it's going to align with the current distribution of social security spending. But there are big risks in these numbers. And I would hate to be unduly cynical when I say it's an election in Scotland in May 2026. But actually, in the UK as a whole, and perhaps even more in Scotland, we are up against the limits of what revenue can provide, and some of the likely escalations in cost, especially given the aging nature of the population and the UK's resistance to having more young people arrive because they're foreign, means that costs are just simply going to rise. So I'm very skeptical about this. I'm going to make no bones about it because the numbers don't add up at any reasonable level. But I also think that we are not going to be able to do this in the tax and revenue envelope we have in Scotland, because we are not going to enjoy the level of economic growth that could even begin to provide it. And that's the 2026 to 31 is going to be a very seriously financially challenged Parliament.
Thank you, Murray. Siobhan, I think you were once involved with Cllr. Is that an organisation that you would expect would have a big role to play in any kind of minimum income guarantee that Scotland might promote?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really been involved in Cllr so much. I'm on the Cllr barriers to elected office, but as obviously being an elected councillor, yes. So there's a couple of couple of issues, and the minimum income guarantee. The I think it was, I can't remember the exact. The minimum income guarantee report that came out just at the beginning of this week is kind of talking through what that might look like, what those strategies might look like, what the phase might look like. So the analysis is that, in the first instance there is a pilot and that be done, but it so effectively what they're looking at is a single person minimum income of 11,500, if I remember correctly. Single parent with 2 children comes up to 28,000. So there's that kind of minimum income that we need to get people to reach to. There is a financial report based on that as well, in terms of how we manage that, and I can appreciate Professor Pittock's cynicism in that process, shall we say. I think the issue that we have, of course, now, and this is what the introduction to the report says, is that we've kind of reached a point where we perhaps can't afford to do that. So in the same week that the minimum income guarantee report came out, of course, we've had the Scottish Government Population Health report that's also come out as well, that's suggesting that, in terms of preventative health measures, we not only create a healthier society, but actually in income terms, we save a lot of money. So they're saying that, for every pound that we invest in preventative health, it will come, it's save £34 in terms of health prevention, and that's things like, lots of different ways that we can do that. So the financial impact of poor health, I suppose, is my point. The financial impact of poor health is not just on our well-being, not just affecting our poorest, but it has a massive economic impact on our society. Part of the reason that the NHS is in difficulties, and it's not all the reasons, but part of the reason is that, of course, we have a very unhealthy and sick population. We go back to the UK Westminster government's recent changes, of course, then those changes to disability benefits will impact our poorest and will impact on the health of our poorest. Poverty brings poorer health. The minimum income guarantee, and I can see how Professor Pittock would see that as kind of almost going back to the university principal vision. There's vision, but no real infrastructure in order to build that. But there's a certain degree here of how we start to look at our finances, how we start to look at our priorities. So the minimum income guarantee paper looks at various seven types of taxes and so forth that we could perhaps look at. It does involve commitment from the UK government and working with the UK government as well. One of the proposals that they're suggesting is that we increase the Scottish child payment to £55 a week, and they're requesting that be done by 2030 at the latest. Now, we know that the Scottish child payment has reduced poverty, so they're looking at that as a level of, this is how we can bring child poverty under control. So not under control, but to reduce child poverty. I don't think we'll ever quite resolve that. So there's lots of issues there that we have to unpick. And I was working my way through that report this morning, and there's, looking at how we can finance, because that's the question that I have. How do we do that? Because what we're doing is, if we're beginning at a preventative health measure, we still have to kind of need the funding to keep the services and the structures and the infrastructure that we have going, but we need to invest. And that money for investment will be, as Professor Pittock says, absolutely phenomenal. So there are huge issues ahead, but there are times where perhaps we need to. One of the things that the minimum income report suggested, of course, is if you look at the taxation of countries who kind of have a system of minimum income guarantee, then they are higher than the UK tax system. They are higher in proportion to us. But what it does give is other advantages in other areas in terms of kind of social inclusion, anti-poverty measures and so forth as well. So it's finding that balance and looking to other European countries to see how they've managed to do that and whether it's been as successful as we hope it would be.
Thank you, Siobhan. Murray, the Scottish Government's response to the report was that they were already trying to do a lot of the things that the report calls for, tackling child poverty, eradicating it. But just as Siobhan alluded to there, I think they said that they wouldn't be able to afford it at the moment unless they had more powers to raise taxes. Is that correct?
Well, it may not even be that, but I mean, the Scottish government's actually done quite a good amount on child poverty, and it shows that actually targeted support on child poverty can make a significant difference to the extent of its impact, and they deserve congratulation for that. The question about this, though, is a broader one. The IFS have, though they haven't reached a final verdict, has suggested that Scotland's current tax increases at the higher rates are at best revenue neutral and may have actually led to a decline in Scottish tax income. HMRC are estimating £60 million loss by migration to Scotland from higher rate tax income. You cannot diverge your tax system from the UK tax system beyond a certain point unless you have high levels of state consent to do that. And that's pretty clear that we may come to that later. But it's pretty clear that doesn't exist in Scotland. You see, if you were in Donegal, you're paying 50 to 70 euro to visit a GP, but there's a high level of state consent in the Republic of Ireland, so they think, and they are getting a better health service for that, that's worth doing. And they're not wishing to change to the situation in Derry where you can visit one for free, except it takes forever to get one. But in Scotland, there would be the demand is that services should never fall behind the UK average, and that people don't appreciate services are ahead of the UK average enough, because the Scottish government gets a lot of blame for child poverty, even though it's much better at it. So I think the trouble here is that there isn't really room for the Scottish government to increase taxes, and the taxes it's already increased have perhaps not brought in the income that were modelled. And that's very clearly from organisations like the IFC and HMRC. That's clearly their view. And I think that it's important to listen to the evidence from the people who are responsible for collecting it, that's HMRC, and perhaps the Liddy organisation for looking at tax and spend issues across the UK as a whole, and that's IFS.
Thank you, Murray. Siobhan, just a bit of crystal ball gazing. What are the chances, do you think, that this report will be, or that this idea will be piloted in Scotland after the Holyrood elections next year?
I would like to think that would be a manifesto promise. And when I was looking at this morning, I thought that's something that maybe we could look at. But it's hard to say at this stage. I think we certainly need some boldness in our thinking as we move into the next kind of 5-6 years of the next Scottish Parliament, and longer term as well, because there's a lot of issues, a lot of problems. We have a lot of financial issues, and people are suffering as a result of that. So I'd like to think that we could at least look at the strategy. I'd like to think that we would at least bring in. There's 10 recommendations, I think, in overall, that we would at least bring in and refine or improve some of the recommendations that we're already doing. But other issues, like, so for instance, looking at the Scottish child payment, there's other issues around the universal tax credit in terms of the 5-week wait and so forth that was recommended. We try and remove those kind of barriers there. And of course, the 2-child cap is something that we've immediately done, and that's something that they asked for to be done as a matter of priority as well, to remove that 2-child cap. So there's things that we're already doing. I would like to see us at least trying some of those measures, if not quite getting to the minimum income guarantee. But I think it's something that we should be looking to aspire to. Absolutely.
Thank you, Siobhan. So in a speech this week, First Minister John Swinney set out his vision for Scotland. Mr Swinney's speech compared and contrasted where Scotland was in the 20th century with where Scotland is currently in the 21st century. It's quite a balanced speech. For every negative facing Scotland, he talked about dark clouds and the like. But for every negative, he offered a solution or a positive. He talked about dark clouds and uncertainties, but he also said that Scotland I seek is a modern and dynamic and enterprising and compassionate, well placed to ride the waves of change rather than being buffeted by them, a Scotland where tomorrow is better than today, because together we have made it so. Murray, I'm going to... oh no, sorry, Siobhan, can I come to you first? Yeah, of course. Yes, I'm sorry, Murray, but... So what did you catch the speech, and if so, what were your thoughts on it?
I did catch the speech. I thought it laid out quite clearly where, like you said, where our values were and how we were to move forward. I did get an email as part of my kind of branch secretary role saying that, the misinformation around it, that, how dare John Swinney delay Scottish independence until 2020. But of course, that information was incorrect. It was the conference that was 2050, 2050. I was at the National Council yesterday, and we looked at the roadmap to independence, what that might look like, how we get there, and what we do. I think that some of the issues that we've talked about here across the board has been very clear that independence is one of the key factors that would allow us freedom and allow us fiscal freedom in order to build some of the structures that we want to do. I think that this huge attack on public services that's been occurring the last kind of 10, 12 years or so has left pretty much all of the UK on its knees in terms of public services. So the need to rebuild that, the need to kind of rebuild all those kind of structures that have perhaps been chipped away becomes a matter of priority now. I was left convinced, not by John, not just by his speech at the 2050 conference, but his speech yesterday, that independence will figure hard and centre at the manifesto for the Scottish elections for next year. But what that looks like is the big question. In 2014, of course, there was a lot of vision. And again, this comes back to kind of something that Professor Pittock said about the university principal structure. There's a whole lot of vision, but not infrastructure. And this is what we lacked in 2014. We had that vision, and then we kind of began to build that infrastructure. And that seems to have kind of trust in that infrastructure, I think, has fallen away to a certain degree as confidence in the SNP as a government began to fall away as well. To return to his speech then, I think that his focus was clear. But what we need is a reality check on how we build that next vision as part of, and we need to kind of think in terms of how independence will do it, what will be the impact of independence, how that will allow us freedom, fiscal freedom in order to invest, but actually what we do in those intervening years as we begin to kind of navigate those years, and how we manage devolution within that kind of transitional year as well. So the devil's in the detail, right? We need to offer a very, very convincing infrastructure that would allow people to feel safe and confident that we can deliver something that's meaningful. And I think that's maybe where we need to start building now, is that we need those plans. We need those strategies, and they need to be costed in order to allow people to have confidence that we could do this as a country, independent or transitioning into independence.
Thank you, Siobhan. Murray, the Scottish Tories said that the First Minister's speech was, I think they used the word description of it was a word salad. The First Minister, he highlighted the winter fuel payments as an example of spending money as investment. Winter fuel payments is going to mean less stress on the NHS during winter. He also cited the Scottish Government's investment into eradicating child poverty and said that was an investment in the future, but it also had led to savings in the child care system. So do you think that this is viable, that it's investing in the future to kind of keep costs down? You called it quite hard-nosed.
Well, we'll see. I mean, there are savings attached to the First Minister's plans for the public sector, and it's quite clear that there are elements of the public sector that are a long way behind. I mean, to put it bluntly, the IT abilities of the private section that we expect every day in other walks of life. Mm-hmm. So that's only one example. So of course there was a positivity there. And I've already discussed the importance of child payment policies, child poverty alleviation policies. But I mean, obviously, yeah, the winter fuel payment's back, but it's back basically at the same level as England plus a couple of quid. And that's once again, that's what I was indicating before, when the notion of state consent. I think the issue is, and I'm blunt about this, there are a lot of people and the SNP have been partly responsible for this in earlier years and encouraging the idea that independence was around the corner in the aftermath of 2014. A lot of people have blamed it for obstructing the process, but actually it's not at all clear that that meaningful independence is what people want in sufficient numbers, because it's about state consent. Why are we shadowing England's policy? Because the pressure will be on that nobody to do worse than in England, and if possible better. So there's a real problem that the Scottish government has managing the Labour state, and that's how the SNP rose to power, is you don't reform it in any way, and you also have to shadow what the UK does, or you have to do better. If the UK does anything wrong, you must mitigate it. And that all adds to cost and all actually takes away from the prospect of meaningful and ambitious initiatives which differentiate Scotland. Now, I'm not necessarily blaming the government for that. This is the political environment we live in. But if people want to be independent on the basis of rebuilding a Wilsonian Britain north of the Tweed, that's one thing. And if they want an independent state with state consent, which will do things differently, that's another thing. Those positions are both occupied by people who support independence for Scotland. But the trouble is the first one is fundamentally one which shadows the UK as a state and doesn't think of itself as a separate state. And because it shadows the UK as a state, it simply means that the Scottish government has to shadow the UK as a state. And while it does that, it is effectively a devolved government. And the independence that is being proffered is one which is fundamentally linked very strongly to the domestic policies of the UK government, whether that's Labour or Conservative. And that's a really awkward position to be in. And I think John Swinney's speech suggests a desire to break out of that slightly. But of course, he's received a lot of criticism already from the usual suspects, whose vision for a future of Scotland is that absolutely nothing must change. And that's been a vision for Scotland for a long time. And it's not a vision that is getting us anywhere fast. So my view is, if you want a better, different, dynamic Scotland that can chart a different course for itself, you have to believe in a different, dynamic Scotland. You can't believe in a UK or UK plus Scotland. But you may prefer a UK plus Scotland, and that's great too, if that's what you want. But you have to make your mind up. There isn't a middle ground here.
Thank you, Murray. I must admit, Mr. Swinney's speech did remind me of Harold Wilson's White Heat of Technology speech as well in the 1960s. We're almost out of time, Siobhan, but I couldn't help but notice that both you and Murray used the word independence in your excellent responses. As far as I can tell, the First Minister did not use the word independence in his speech the other day. Do you think he should have? Did he? I didn't notice it.
I was just sitting thinking, I'm pretty sure he did, but I would need to go back and check that. If he didn't, then he should have. But I'm pretty sure, I think he did.
This is interesting, isn't it? No one can actually agree whether it was said or not.
Anyway,
that's a problem in itself then, right?
No, and certainly, Mr. Swinney, I'm happy to apologise to you profusely if you did use the word independence in your speech.
Going to go back and look at the transcript now.
Yeah, okay. Well, we are out of time now, so that's it for this week, folks. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on your generosity. So to everyone who has donated and to anyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, we thank you very much. We could not exist without your support. We've raised almost £11,000 this year so far, but that is £13,000 less than we need to be on target to pay our monthly bills. However, right now we need to raise at least £4,000 immediately to pay our most pressing bills if we're to keep the lights on and the cameras rolling. You know that our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or please just simply donate whatever you can afford. But thank you again to our guests, to Councillor Siobhan Tolley and to Professor Murray Pittock. Thank you very much for giving up a sizable chunk of your weekend. Okay. Right.
Thank you. Good to see you, Bram.
And you, thank you for your patience with me all. Goodbye.